Excellent, thank you very much. So yeah, no, so as George said, I'm Ken Lyon and I run Lyon Local Gov. I'll talk a bit more about myself in a minute, but I'll introduce you to my colleague Paul Clark first. Paul, do you want to just say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Paul Clark. I'm an associate supporting Lyon Local Government. I spent 20 years working in accountancy throughout different local authorities, sort of a background of both in service and corporate accounting, covering financial systems, value for money, capital revenue, and project management. And I've now been sort of in my fourth year as an associate supporting combination of financial modelling and business case, particularly economic and financial cases of business case development.
Brilliant, cheers, Paul. So yeah, and I'm Ken Lyon. I also have a long background in local government. Spent 17 years doing various different things, but the last decade mainly kind of senior change type roles at places like Nottingham and Birmingham. So and then as assistant chief exec at South Kesteven for 3 years as well. So yeah, so if I just give a bit of an overview about sort of who we are. So yeah, as I say, we're a small consultancy, particularly focused on local government, as you can imagine from the name, and basically very keen to focus on financial sustainability, maximise value for money, and the other thing being a real ownership of outcomes within councils and services. And our kind of view is we've done quite a bit of work around the kind of income optimization piece, and there's lots of different types of income optimization stuff, and we can talk about all of them in the questions. We're specifically so there's things like commercial and traded services, use of assets, recovery costs from other public bodies, and then fees and charges to users. And a load of the themes are very consistent across the piece, but we're going to focus most of our time talking around on the fees and charges and the kind of which provides a kind of build up to some of the other things. But as I say, in the questions, we're very happy to discuss other things as well, because we've got a raft of experiences on a whole range of those kind of things. We think so. One of the things we've been doing a lot with councils over the last couple of years is around fees and charges reviews. So and I call it kind of like the kind of doing the boring well. You're not going to win any. You're not going to turn up at the MJ Awards with a massive trophy for having done a really good for getting your pricing policy right, probably. But actually, you can make a real significant contribution to your MTFP. And actually, you can deliver money. You can deliver money back into the budget very quickly. And what we found is, and we'll talk about this later, is that things like the kind of basics around really understanding what your costs are, understanding the policy objectives for the service that you're delivering, and things like price sensitivity are really important. And we found that taking on some of the challenge in that area has been really significant. And we've worked with a number of councils. I think we're about to start work with our 14th review of fees and charges well, actually started on it this week. So we work with a number of councils of all types, actually, on fees and charges reviews of different types. And each of them, we found that in every area, councils are either underpricing their services in some areas, or they've got their and there's different things that they can do to make sure that they're maximising their income from it, or actually it's identified as we're doing with some of the areas that the services in there that there's not actually any reason for you to be delivering them. You're losing money on delivering them, and you're better off making a managed withdrawal and enabling someone else to do them. So those have been the kind of two main outcomes that we found from them. And what we found, we found that when we've taken the reviews, there's, as I say, a very quick payback period. So one of the things we implemented, it's about a 5-week payback period for the investment of doing a review, which is pretty nifty, to be honest. So we're so that's kind of some of the places we've worked with on them. So as I say, some of the things with the kind of doing the boring well, type stuff, you kind of look at it and you say, well, there's nothing new here. What we already knew all this. But actually, what we find when we kind of dig into things is that that there's quite a lot of consistent learning that we found from working across councils. And the first kind of one is the kind of bucket is around there not being a clear rationale as to why a charge is set at a certain level. So the most common thing that we see, if we one of the first things we ask whenever we engage with any service is, okay, so why do you charge that amount? What are you doing? And usually, although they're almost always a better answer than this, but usually it comes down to it's always been that amount and we've added some inflation on, or we've always, or we think it's about the right amount, but we've actually not got any science behind it. Or any robust evidence behind it. So there's not always the case. There's some real pockets of real good practice that we've been able to share as well with other things in certain industries, in certain areas of councils. But one thing that's been common everywhere that we've worked is that there's kind of been a lack of a clear or up-to-date policy around income and fees and charges. And particularly, even where there is one, it's not been very live or living. So it's one of the things that we say, actually, to make this real, to make this bite in the organisation, what you've got to do is have something that says this is the way we do it, and then we can hang all of our individual practice off our policy. I mentioned around the zero and the either inflationary only or not, or sort of random price increases. And what we've discovered with that is it isn't it's not it's not laziness or anything like that. What we found is that actually there's been the lack of capacity to provide an evidence-based challenge around it. So we've been able to help with saying, okay, well, this is a wider bit of evidence that you've not considered, or this is that you should think through. Big thing that we've found as well is around benchmarking. So, and most councils do benchmarking, but mostly they benchmark against a really narrow group, and so quite often you get kind of self-fulfilling things. So, for example, we did a piece of work with one of the councils and we were looking at the land charges, and we were saying, well, they look low, and they said, no, they're the top of our benchmarking group, and they benchmarked with 4 other authorities, and they were at top of those 4 authorities. But we were able to look at our database of another 40 that we had at the time. We've got a bigger database now, and found that they were although they were the top of their group that they'd chosen to benchmark against, there were actually 34th out of 40 in the across the wider piece, which as I say, there was some other, we had to understand the cost with it as well, but it helped open up that conversation. The other piece, particularly in unitary and county councils, we often find income in adult social care that isn't tapped into, particularly through the kind of the financial assessment side of things, where some of the processes are a bit clunky, and then also, as I say, a perception that sometimes it charges are over recovering costs, when actually, when we've done the piece of work, which Paul will give you a talk through a bit later, show that actually they're under recovering. So actually, there's room to move up. A couple of other things that we've really seen that have been quite impactful. So firstly is around inconsistent allocation of central costs and charges, or not understanding of them. So some businesses some service units not taking those into account at all, so not really understanding the full costs. So things like property costs and HR and finance and that kind of things, or where they are understood that they're not, that they aren't clear how they're calculated, which then causes a lot of tension with the business and this corporate centre, and helping with some clarity around that. And then and particularly we find also related to that when charging amongst the public sector, we often find that the council that's the provider is actually losing money on it. They're actually subsidising and other councils in doing it, because they haven't considered all their costs in doing that. And the last kind of key thing we found, and I think this is becoming increasingly common, is that there's a kind of perception that things won't be done here. So because something's been raised perhaps once or twice previously with politically and been knocked down, that they're not looked into again. And what we found is that actually often that perception isn't based on on reality or based on all of the evidence, and actually looking at a different suite of evidence can be really helpful. So recently we've been working with an authority. We're looking at introducing garden waste charging, and kind of been knocked away politically a couple of times before, because they were concerned about protecting the people on lowest incomes in their community, and we were able to use some demographic data and their service usage to demonstrate that actually the people that effectively the people on the lowest incomes were subsidising the people on the highest in the biggest properties in their community, and do a load of other stuff, and then suggest some lenses of which, if they wanted to protect those people in the lowest quartile, they could do so, and still generate way more money. But, and like I say, none of these things are things that you have to do, but they're all things that should be considered. So I'm just going to the next slide. So we've kind of we've suggested there's kind of 4 things really to kind of setting out a consistent approach. So there's around the policy framework, tools and techniques, then that kind of ownership and challenge of service, and then the transparent governance and decision making. And Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Right, thank you, Ken. So the first of those elements, I think, is to actually have a coherent charging policy, and by this we mean something that's a bit more than this is what we will increase our prices by, but that sort of focus of why we are doing it. And we would suggest one way of looking at this is through sort of a matrix where you look at 2 key components. That's the level of regulation and the level of other people that are providing that service in your area. And that should be sort of looked through a lens of sort of all the wider policy and risk. But what we would say is, so probably the easiest ones to think about are the ones in the top right corner and the bottom left. So in the top right, if there's a lot of people providing a service and there's not really anything to stop how that is provided, or very large rules or regulations, then you'd want to look at why you exist alongside anyone else in that. So examples might be cleaning, catering, some of the off-street parking provision. So what we would say there is, if there aren't wider benefits for it, you'll be looking at a minimum to recover your full cost of that. Whereas in the bottom left corner, where you're the only person providing it, and there's lots of legislation around what you can do and what you can charge. So for example, sort of fines, parking fines, local elections. Actually, there is a huge amount in benchmarking or sort of looking at what sensitivities could be done, because actually most of those things are regulated, that your hands forced in lots of those things. So looking at if your service is the right size is more the way to go, and actually how the performance metrics are. Then the other 2 segments are sort of where you're the only person providing it, but there's not many rules or regulations stopping others doing it. So things like libraries, museums, you're often doing those because there is that wider cost. There is a wider benefit to the public of doing it and your residents. So what we would suggest there is a blended approach where you understand your cost, but you also understand the benefits to your residents of doing that, so that you can actually say, we are putting this much money in for these benefits to the wider thing. So it's not just about trying to break even or cost recovery in those types of services. And then the final quadrant is where there are lots of people providing the service, but actually there's lots of rules and regulations about it. So one of the areas we would say is sort of the social care provision there. And what we would say is that reasons why you would still want to exist in that market. There could be the risk of market failure, so you want to be able to step in if a major provider fails, or it could be that actually there's bits of the market that aren't working well, so are there niches that aren't provided, or you can't commission those services. So actually it makes sense to have a presence within that market. And again, what we would say is understand your costs, but also the second side of it is to know what those wider benefits are, all the risks that you are mitigating by being involved in that service, so you can explain and understand, well, if we aren't cost recovering, this is why it's worth putting money into the service area. So that's sort of our initial stepping stone of policy, and then what we have built upon that is a series of tools and techniques that can support that. So there are other ways of doing this, but the way we look at it is saying, depending on which section that a service falls into, there are different tools and techniques that might be more relevant. So for example, talking about something that is statutorily controlled, and the government sets prices, not really a huge amount of point in doing benchmarking because everyone's going to come out with the same prices. And similarly, if you are primarily doing something for wider benefits, it's important to consider all of those non-cashable benefits, less so if you are competing or there are lots of other providers that you could commission rather than do it yourself. So I'm just going to run through a couple of those things very briefly, a couple of those tools. So this is our first one. This is a tool to look at your total cost of your service. So we built this up from sort of a staffing upwards. So the first part is sort of an enabling to put how the team is formed. We work with each authority to sort of build that up behind the scenes to sort of put the individual salary scales in and any additional add-ons to that, and the ability to overwrite any standard hours, build in any of the non-costs that are attributable to that service within the sort of budget of that. The bits where we really tried to focus the service and each authority on is some of the costs that aren't directly attributed to that budget. So are there any more senior staff that provide support or part of their management of that service area where it isn't part of the controllable budget and not part of corporate overheads? Are there any other teams that have separate budgets that actually don't sort of internally charge for them? So for example, if you've got a customer care team that sort of deal with all the compliments and complaints and feed them through to the different departments, have its own budget, actually is it appropriate to apportion some of that when trying to understand the total cost of that service? The ability to add those on, and then finally an ability to add on a contribution from the central and corporate charges, either as a calculation that's a proportion of the overall service, FTEs, or actually if there's something more complicated, an ability to just directly input a number to get to a position to say this is the central cost element of that. Also the ability, if they aren't already included elsewhere, to put in accommodation costs or depreciation if there's large amounts of machinery and equipment within a service. That gets you to a position where you can look at your costs through different lenses. So that the first is sort of a total cost if you're trying to understand the service, or if you're providing it to another council and they're sharing, and you know that they're about a third of the service, you can sort of look at how your cost compares to what you might be recovering back from that authority at a sort of glance. Second one is if there is just a single service being provided, so from a single area. So for example, if you've got HMO housing licenses, so houses of multiple occupation, and you know roughly how many licenses you expect to issue each year, again that will look at the total cost of the service to tell you what the cost is if you're just looking at the costs associated with the direct budget of that. If you're also considering some of those wider overheads within the sort of like the intra-departmental charging, and then finally sort of the overall cost. And again, we can split it in different ways to look at the cost per hour on those different bases, per grade, or actually as a blended one. And then we've got other tools on the back of that where we can look at splitting that out. If there are multiple different lines of service and business, you can split those between different ones. Then the only other one I will do a very quick multitasking me in the morning is not great, is a sensitivity tool. So this is something we've designed for looking at both when you've got the cost side of things, this is looking more at the income side. And if you change your prices, what could be the impact both in terms of the income that's generated from the change in price, but also any potential change in usage. So what we've developed here is the ability to create a base case. So this is just hypothetical data, but we've used the bereavement services as an example and sort of split down that you've got various streams of business. So the cremations, direct cremations, elements of the burial, and then sort of a wider all other income streams that are relatively minor, just so that we can make sure that they're modeled, but you don't have to look at each one in turn. And then you can look at different scenarios where there are different changes to either the price in a percentage term or an absolute term, and the expectation in usage of those different changes. Again, what we have behind the scenes are tools to help with some of those things. So looking at trend analysis or different ways that you could look to see if one bit of data is correlated to other things. So if there's some easy way to estimate usage, all things considered equal, such as population, to drive some of the expected usage. So it's not just what we did last year is what we are expecting this year. And then the tool will then allow a comparison between the various options that you've put in to say how much has that deviated from that original base case, and also absolute income from the year before. And then sort of looking at that in terms of a service line by service line to say this is the sort of income we would expect given our projections on price and volume changes. So that's a couple of the tools that we tend to find are useful and could be considered in different ways for most service areas. And again, not saying that these models are the only way of doing it, but these are some of the learning that we have found. So talking about the policy side, I think what is important is not to try and find just a line of one size fits all. There should be some consistent rules, but actually the different types of services that you have will have different reasons and rationales for those charges. Some will be cost recovery, some will be about making a profit where legislation allows it to, and other ones are there are actually wider benefits for your residents, and actually we understand the cost, but we are comfortable at the level of subsidy that we are putting into those services because we think that there are wider benefits for our residents. As Ken's already mentioned, sometimes if you just look at your nearest neighbours, you end up in an accidental sort of cartel of all the people benchmarking against each other, and actually you just end up self-fulfilling the costs that you've currently got. We also say, regardless of the category that it comes into, it's really important to actually understand the cost of the first part of that, and that's a wider cost, including sort of the non-direct costs, not just your budget, if there are other sort of elements to make it up, including corporate costs and your intra-departmental costs. You can't really do a cost-benefit analysis if you don't understand your costs, even if you aren't trying to cost recover in a particular service. And then, yes, so the other two bits, again, sort of flow from the models that we've demonstrated here, that actually don't just assume that a 5% teaching you to suck eggs, but it is early in the morning, at least for me. So don't expect a 5% increase in prices will necessarily generate 5% more income. Always consider the wider context and how price sensitive your prices are to and your usage is according to those prices. And also the final thing, this is a bit more of a technical thing, but what we found an awful lot within budgets is that there's a challenge that there's an expectation that something will happen if nothing is done. But what happens is you present a solution to that, which is then seen as either the net amount becomes a lower pressure, or in fact there's an income generation opportunity. If that is delayed for any reason, it kind of masks what the real impact is to the authority. So if you sort of say, well, we're going to lose £50,000 because a new competitor is coming in, we think that usage is going down, we're going to change all of our prices mid-year, that will increase and offset that and generate another £25,000. So the net impact is we're going to gain £25,000. If that never comes to light, or councillors in the end change their mind, don't want to implement that mid-year, the budget, if you net it off, will just say we're going to lose 25,000. Reality is you're going to be back to that. We're losing 50,000 on top of not generating the 25. So we'd always say our advice would be, if you identify a pressure, put that in alongside the compensating income that is generated and monitor both of those, even if they net off, because one, it's good practice from a risk perspective, but also it demonstrates all the work that is done. Almost sometimes it's like a duck, how much paddling has to be done to actually just keep you in a no worse position in local authority because of the times that we live in.
Cheers, Paul. So I'll just whip through So yeah, so I'd say one of the other things we found we found is really important with all of this stuff around sort of income optimization. There's loads of opportunities around it, but mainly the biggest thing we find is that when we go and engage with a service, and we find the first thing they say is, well, finance just increase our cost by our prices by 5% a year, and they kind of lose that ownership of it within the service and some of that local market knowledge. So what we found is that the kind of real collaboration between finances and services working together, and use of external data and evidence. So, and as I say, that's different to just what's going on in your borough or what's going on in your service. And can include things like demographic data, wider sort of policy information, stuff that often will help people have confidence in making decisions. So quite often people will say, well, if we do that, uh, uh, we'd never change our pricing structure like that because we think it will have this impact. And actually, if you go and look, you go and look at, there's always examples of people that have done similar things elsewhere, or you can compare, or you can understand different types of decisions. You can kind of see what the likely impact is, and help make kind of more evidence based decisions that move away, that turn some of the impossible into possible things. But the other thing I think is around that ability to ask tough questions. So actually, conversation I was having yesterday, saying that, what, look at this. Why are we providing? Why is the council providing this service? I know you've not seen the services done badly, but it's it might not be washing its face, or even getting close to washing its face, or it might just be washing its face. If you're putting a load of effort and energy into doing something that really isn't a priority for the council. So let's be honest about it. We now, having undertaken the process we've been doing, we understand what the full cost of the service is. We can see that that it's not financially lucrative for us to be doing it, and there's no policy objective. There's others that can do this just as well. So why don't we? Why are we in this place? And we've particularly found that actually with some of the stuff we've been doing with services to schools, particularly where some of the kind of more transactional or back officey type services around that sort of real kind of challenge around that. And as I say, that number one thing we really find is helping that culture of people understanding what the full cost of their service is. But our kind of objective with this, and I think whenever we've worked with people on this, and this is our tip for is around that kind of co-owned evidence-based proposals to inform the budget, rather than lobbing stuff on top of them, which we found the approach that the kind of getting under the skin of things with services, and that real kind of collaborative challenge has been really successful at doing. And then finally, really, is around the governance and transparency. What we've generally found around is an incredible amount of inefficient decision making around fees and charges, and sometimes no formal decision making at all. But often you go into an organisation and they'll have made about 50 separate decisions on fees and charges, or income decisions the previous year. There'll have been portfolio holder decisions all over the place, or even officer delegated decisions, but they've gone to one place. And what we found works really well is something really simple around a fees and charges booklet that covers it, either part of the budget process or something else that goes to cabinet. But it covers some of the price changes, is able to cover the policy implications, show what the legislative context is, because that's really important. Actually, what are the bits of legislation you're relying on to charge that amount, and what do they? We found it again with that quite often weaknesses in services, understanding what legislation they're working under, and understanding what the restrictions or the freedoms are within that legislation for charging, and then other elements like VAT status. And so we found, as a general principle, that kind of price setting being owned by the services with challenge from finance, but the governance being owned by finance or someone in the central piece has been a really effective way of doing it. But the other thing that we found through the kind of income optimization work that we've done, and this isn't specific to bringing in external people to do it. It's just general stuff within the council. Is that actually what it enables you to do is get the metal detector out. So because councils charge across so many different areas, it enables to kind of look across the whole of the council. And what it shows is an ability to identify things where the metal detector might be bleeping a bit, and things that you can dig into. And those can come out in lots of different ways. They could come out in new opportunities, or they could come out in challenges. So things that we've found have been like cultural information that have informed things like restructures. So a council we were working with a while ago, but you used a lot of the information we'd found to help inform their finance restructure. And as I say, that could have been found internally. There's nothing particularly special about us, but they help inform it, and some of the training they were going to get, and some of the challenge around it. As I say, some of those things like missed in those kind of undertapped opportunities that aren't really fees and charges, but are, you go, well, you're doing this, you've got skills in this area. There's probably a market. There's probably an opportunity for you to expand and maximise those skills, or is there other things you can do in collaboration with an authority next door where that will give you more resilience and potential opportunity to deliver some efficiencies. And so that challenges around the way things have always been done. We find that it's a big thing around the income optimization piece. We always find pieces where we go, look, guys, this isn't this unless there's a policy reason, and it's absolutely fine, obviously, to subsidise something that there's a policy objective to do this. Unless there's a policy objective for delivering this, you're not the best place to deliver it. You're losing money on it, and they're meant to kind of link to the wider policy. And then. And that kind of stuff around, actually these are the ways to connect with and learn from other organizations. So I think and that just kind of leads on to questions. So really interested to take on any questions. Obviously, please contact us if you want our emails on these afterwards. So please come back with any questions afterwards as well. And we've also just launched a website called feesandcharges.co.uk, where we've got a bit of a benchmarking tool that is available on there that you might find interesting. And again, please do contact us if you have questions around that. So I think that kind of sums up our input